For 38 years, Judge Raymond Coyle had signed his name under sentences that sent men away, and he had slept fine doing it. Then a lawyer mailed him the deed to a brother's farm he hadn't spoken to in 40 years, and out past the broken fence line he found a grave with no name on the stone, only a date, and the date was one he knew by heart. He read the letter twice at the kitchen table before he believed it. Earl was dead. His older brother, the one who left home at 17 and never wrote, the one their mother cried over until the day she passed, dead at 79, alone, on 160 acres outside a town called Pell's Hollow that Raymond had to find on a map. And in his will, in a hand that shook across the page, Earl had left all of it to the brother he hadn't seen since 1985. Raymond was 74. He had been a circuit judge for 38 years before he hung up the robe, and in all that time he'd learned to keep his face still while other people fell apart in front of him. He kept it still now, but his coffee had gone cold by the time he set the letter down, and his hand wasn't as steady as he'd have liked. "Why me?" he said to the empty house. His wife Ellen had been gone 2 years. Cancer, the slow kind. The kind that gives you time to say everything, and still leaves the important things unsaid. The house in Columbus was too big for one man now. He rattled around in it like a stone in a tin can. So when the lawyer's letter came, asking him to come see the property, settle the estate, decide what to keep and what to sell, he found he had no good reason to say no. He had 1,000 reasons to be angry, though. 40 years of them. Earl had been the wild one. Raymond had been the careful one. When their father drank the farm into the ground back in the 60s, Raymond put his head down, took the scholarship, went to law school on borrowed money and his own stubbornness. Earl took a different road. Trouble followed Earl the way a dog follows a man who feeds it. There had been a fight, a bad one, the kind that ends a family. Words got said in their mother's kitchen that couldn't be unsaid. Earl walked out the screen door, and the screen door was the last Raymond ever saw of him. He'd told himself over the years that Earl was the one who left. That made it Earl's fault. A man builds a wall like that, one brick at a time, and after a while he forgets he was the one stacking them. Raymond drove out to Pell's Hollow on a gray morning in late October, the kind of morning where the sky can't decide whether to rain. 3 hours on the interstate, and then an hour on county roads that got narrower and rougher until the asphalt gave up entirely and turned to gravel. The farm sat at the end of a long drive lined with bare walnut trees. A white farmhouse, paint peeling, but the porch was swept and the windows were clean. Somebody had cared about this place. That surprised him. The lawyer met him there, a young man named Dale Forsythe, with a soft handshake and a folder full of papers. He walked Raymond through the house. It was plain and clean and full of a stranger's life. A worn recliner with a quilt folded over the arm, a shelf of paperback westerns, a wood stove, cold now, with a stack of split oak beside it. On the wall above the stove, a single photograph in a cheap frame. 2 boys squinting into the sun, one taller, both barefoot. Raymond stood in front of it a long time. "He kept that?" Raymond said. "Far as I know, it never moved," Dale said. "Your brother wasn't a man for a lot of decoration." There was a checkbook with a balance just over $4,000, a truck in the barn that still ran. 40 years of a life, and it fit in a folder and a handshake. "There's one more thing," Dale said, and something in his voice made Raymond turn. He was real particular about it in the will. There's a plot out past the east pasture, a grave. He asked that it be kept up. He set aside money for it, separate from everything else. $3,000 in a county trust just for the upkeep of that one grave. A family plot? No, sir, just the one grave. I never knew who's in it. Your brother wouldn't say. The county recorded it as a private interment, which is legal out here if you own the land. But there's no name on the record, just a date. The hair on Raymond's arms stood up, and he couldn't have told you why. "Show me," he said. They walked out past the east pasture, where the grass had gone brown and the fence sagged between gray posts. The grave sat under a single oak tree, set off by itself, fenced with a low square of black iron that somebody had painted not long ago. The stone was good granite, not cheap, the kind that costs real money. Raymond knew that because he'd bought one like it for Ellen. There was no name carved into it, no verse, no last words, only a date. March 19th, 1979. Raymond stood very still. Something inside him went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when a clock that's always ticking suddenly stops. He knew that date. He had spent 38 years not letting cases follow him home. You learn that, or you don't last. But there are a few that get in anyway, that wait for you in the dark behind your eyes. March 19th, 1979, was the day a young assistant prosecutor named Raymond Coyle stood in a courtroom and watched a jury find a man guilty of a murder. A man named, he was almost sure, Thomas Greer. He had not thought about Thomas Greer in years. Now, standing over an unmarked grave on his dead brother's farm, he could not think of anything else. "You all right, Judge?" Dale asked. "I'm fine," Raymond said, which was the first lie he'd told in Pell's Hollow, and it would not be the last. He stayed at the farm that night. He told himself it was because the drive home was too far, but that was another lie. He couldn't have left that grave if you'd put a gun to his back. He lit the wood stove the way his father had taught him a lifetime ago, and he sat in his dead brother's recliner with his dead brother's quilt over his knees. And he made himself remember. Thomas Greer, 1978, the trial. Greer had been 26 years old, a mill worker, a quiet man with no record to speak of. A woman named Carol Mathers had been beaten to death in her home outside Pell's Hollow, and the county wanted somebody for it badly, because she was the kind of woman people liked. Greer had done some yard work for her. His prints were in her kitchen. A neighbor swore she'd seen his truck on the road that night. He had no real alibi, only that he'd been home alone. Raymond had been 29, hungry, 3 years out of law school and trying to make a name. He'd been second chair on the prosecution. He'd helped pick the jury. He'd helped write the closing. And when the verdict came back guilty, he'd felt the clean, bright thing young lawyers feel when they win. And he had gone out with the others and had a drink, and he had not thought about Thomas Greer's face when the foreman read the word. He made himself think about it now. He found, when he reached for it, that the face was still there. Greer had not shouted. That was the thing that came back to Raymond in the cold farmhouse. The man had not shouted or wept or cursed the court. He had just turned his head and looked, slow, around the room, like he was trying to understand where he was. And his eyes had stopped on Raymond for a second, the young second chair gathering his papers, and there had been no hate in them, only a question. As if Greer were asking him, "Quiet, you know better, don't you?" And Raymond had looked down at his papers and not answered, and the bailiff had taken the man away. There had been signs. There were always signs, if you were a man who wanted to see them, and Raymond at 29 had not wanted to. The prints in the kitchen were old. Greer had done yard work there in the spring and the killing was in the fall, but no one made much of that. The neighbor's account of the truck had shifted twice between her first statement and the stand, firmed up each time, the way a frightened person's memory firms up when authority keeps nodding at one version. The sheriff had wanted it closed before an election. The town had wanted to feel safe. And a hungry young prosecutor had wanted a win. And all those wants had lined up and pointed at one quiet mill worker. And the machinery had done the rest. Raymond had been a small part of that machinery. He had told himself for 40 years that a small part is no part at all. Sitting there, he knew that was the biggest lie of all the ones he'd told. Greer got life. There was no death penalty in that county then. Life in the state penitentiary, and Raymond moved on. He made prosecutor, then judge, then a long career of careful men in careful rooms. And somewhere in a cell, a man he'd helped put there grew old, or didn't. March 19th, 1979. That was a year after the trial. What happened on that date? He didn't know. He'd lost track of Greer the moment the man left his courtroom, the way you lose track of a stone you've thrown into a river. But Earl knew. Earl had cared enough to buy good granite and set aside $3,000 and paint an iron fence. Earl, who never finished high school, who couldn't keep a job or a marriage, who their whole family had written off as the failure. Earl had spent the last of his money keeping up a grave with no name. Raymond did not sleep much that night. In the morning he started looking, because that was the only thing he knew how to do. He found Earl's papers in a steel cabinet in the spare room, and they were not the papers of a careless man. Folders labeled in block letters, receipts going back decades, and in the bottom drawer under a wool blanket a cardboard box, and inside the box a stack of spiral notebooks, the cheap kind from a drugstore, 3 of them, the cardboard covers soft with handling. Raymond opened the first one at the kitchen table. Earl's handwriting was rough, the spelling worse, the lines crowded together like a man who couldn't afford to waste paper. But the words were clear enough. Tom came today. They let him out. He don't look good. Doctor says his lungs. I told him he can stay as long as he wants. He don't believe a stranger would do that. I told him I ain't a stranger. I told him I've been writing the parole board about him for 6 years. He cried. First time I seen a grown man cry like that. Raymond's hands were not steady. He read on. The notebooks told it in pieces, the way a man tells a thing to himself, with no audience, no need to explain. Earl had drifted into Pell's Hollow in the early 70s, found work at the same mill where Thomas Greer worked. They'd been friends, not close, just two men who ate lunch on the same loading dock. And Earl had known, the way a man knows a thing in his gut, that Tom Greer was no killer. Everybody said he'd done it, Earl wrote. I knew different. A man works beside you, you know what he is. Tom Greer wouldn't kill a snake in his own yard. But nobody asked me. Nobody asks a man like me anything. When the verdict came, Earl had gone to the trial. He'd sat in the back, and he had seen, he wrote, the young prosecutor, the sharp one, the one who smiled when it was over. Raymond put the notebook down and walked out onto the porch and stood in the cold until his eyes stopped stinging. He had been seen. All those years he'd been a man doing a job, and he had never once imagined that someone in the back of that courtroom was watching him win and knowing he was wrong. He went back in and kept reading, because a coward stops, and Raymond Coyle had been called a lot of things, but never that. Earl had not let it go. That was the thing about Earl that the family never understood, that Raymond himself had never understood. The same stubbornness that made Earl impossible to live with made him impossible to stop once he'd decided a thing was true. He'd written letters, to the parole board, to the newspaper, to a legal aid office 3 counties over, for years. Most of them never got answered. He'd saved the few that did, polite little notes that said nothing, and he'd saved them like they were gold. And then, in 1978, 6 years into a life sentence, Thomas Greer had gotten sick, and the prison had let him out on a medical release to die, because a dying man in a cell cost the state money. And Earl Coyle, who had nothing, took him in. I give him the back room, Earl wrote. He likes to sit on the porch in the morning. Says he forgot what far away looks like. 8 years he looked at a wall. I caught him just looking at the tree line for an hour. Didn't say nothing. Just let him look. Thomas Greer had lived 11 months on that farm. The notebooks counted them. Good days and bad. Days he was strong enough to help mend fence. Days he couldn't get out of bed. Earl drove him to a doctor in town who took cash and didn't ask questions. And the whole time, Earl kept working the only case he had, which was the truth, trying to get someone, anyone, to listen before the man died with a murderer's name on him. The little things were the worst to read. Earl had written them down without meaning to break a man's heart 40 years later, and that was exactly why they did it. Tom won't sleep in a bed, Earl wrote in one entry. Says it's too soft. He's used to the bunk. So I took the mattress off and put it on the floor, and he sleeps fine now. 8 years on a steel shelf. A man forgets soft. Took Tom to the river today. He stood in the water with his boots on and didn't say nothing for a long time. On the way back, he said, Earl, you know the worst part? I said no. He said, the worst part is you start to believe it. After enough years, you start to think, maybe you did do it. Maybe you forgot. I said you didn't do it, Tom. He said, I know that now. Out here, I know it. In there, I wasn't sure no more. Tom asked me why I do this, why I drove him to doctors and let him use my truck and write all them letters. I didn't have a good answer. I said because somebody should. He said nobody ever did before. I said, well, now somebody does. Raymond read that one 3 times. There was a stretch in the middle of the second notebook where Greer had been strong for a while, that summer of 1978, and the entries got lighter. Earl wrote that Tom had fixed the pump on the well, that Tom knew engines, that the two of them had spent a whole Sunday getting the old truck to run right, and laughed about it after. Tom had planted a row of tomatoes along the south side of the house, where the light was good, and Earl noted when the first ones came in. Red, he wrote, so red they looked painted, and the two of them ate them standing up at the counter with salt and didn't say a word the whole time. Raymond went and looked, later, and the spot along the south wall was still there, gone wild now, but you could see where a row had been. He stood over it a while. Then the entries got shorter again, and the spaces between them got longer, and Raymond understood without being told that the good summer was ending and the man was starting to die. And the whole time, under all of it, Earl had been working. There were two columns to every week in those notebooks almost. One column was Tom. The other was the letters, the names, the slow, grinding effort of one uneducated man trying to move a system built to ignore him. He almost did it. That was the part that broke Raymond clean in two. In the last notebook, dated early 1979, Earl wrote that he'd found her, the neighbor, the woman whose word had put Tom's truck on that road. Her name was June Halloway, and she'd moved to another town and she was sick herself. And she'd told Earl, sitting at her own kitchen table, that she'd never been sure, that the sheriff had shown her a picture and told her it was the truck, and she'd been scared, and she'd said yes because that was the answer everyone wanted. She told Earl she'd swear to it, she'd put it in writing. She was tired of carrying it. She wrote it out in her own hand, Earl wrote, signed it. I got it locked up safe. Monday, I drive it to the legal man in the city. Tom don't know yet. I want to tell him when it's done. I want to watch his face when I tell him he's a free man and everybody knows it. The next entry was 4 days later. It was 3 lines. Tom passed in the night. In his sleep, the doctor says, the lungs finally quit. He never knew. I was 4 days too slow. God forgive me. I was 4 days too slow. Raymond sat at the table for a long time with that notebook open in front of him. The wood stove ticked as it cooled. Outside, a wind came up and worked at the bare walnut trees. March 19th, 1979. The date on the stone. The day Thomas Greer died a guilty man, 4 days before his brother could make him innocent. And Earl had buried him on his own land, under good granite, with no name because Raymond understood it now, understood it all at once. Because Earl could not bring himself to carve the name of an innocent man under the word that the world still believed. He would not put Greer on that stone with a murderer's shadow still on it. He'd buried his friend, and he'd kept fighting. The $3,000 for upkeep. The fence painted fresh. A grave kept ready, waiting for the day the name could go on clean. 40 years. Earl had waited 40 years and died waiting. If you have made it this far into Raymond's story, I'd ask you to stay with it, because what an old judge does next is the part I have wanted to tell you from the start. Raymond Coyle had spent his whole life believing he was the brother who'd done something with his time. The judge. The respectable one. And his brother had been the failure, the drifter, the family shame. He sat in that cold farmhouse, and he understood that he had it exactly backwards. Earl had spent 40 years on the one thing that mattered. Raymond had spent 40 years climbing. He could have driven home. He could have sold the farm, kept the grave fund going, and let the whole thing stay buried under the oak tree. No one would ever know. The lawyer didn't know. The county didn't know. Thomas Greer was dead, and Earl was dead, and June Halloway was surely dead by now, too. Raymond went and found the locked box. It was a fire safe, gray steel, bolted to the floor of the closet. He found the key on Earl's ring, the one Dale had handed him with the truck keys. Inside, wrapped in plastic against the damp, was a stack of paper that Earl had guarded for 40 years. The signed statement of June Halloway, dated February 1979, in a careful, sick woman's hand, swearing she had never been sure of the truck, that she'd been led to her answer. Notarized. Earl had found a notary. Of course he had. The original trial transcript, dog-eared and underlined, that Earl must have paid for a copy of out of money he didn't have. A letter from a state appeals lawyer, dated 1981, 2 years after Greer died, saying that with the witness recantation there might be grounds to clear the record, but that posthumous exoneration was rare, expensive, and slow. And did Mr. Coyle have means to pursue it? Earl had not had means. Earl had had a farm and a grave and a promise. And under all of it, a single sheet in Earl's own block letters, the last page, undated, the kind of thing a man writes and rereads. When somebody finally listens, the name goes on the stone. Not before. He gets it clean or he don't get it. I own that much. I was 4 days too slow once. I won't be slow on this. I'll wait as long as it takes. Raymond Coyle, who had sentenced men for 38 years, who had been called Your Honor by 3 generations of frightened people, put his head down on his dead brother's kitchen table and wept like he had not wept at his own wife's grave. Then he got up and he washed his face in the cold water from the tap, and he did the thing he should have done 40 years before. He went to work. He knew how courts worked. That was the one gift he had that Earl never did. Earl had spent 40 years writing letters to people who threw them away because Earl didn't know which door to knock on. Raymond knew every door. He'd built half of them. He started with the county. He drove into Pell's Hollow and sat in a diner that still said open, even though the hours had been cut to breakfast and lunch. And he asked an old waitress named Mavis if anybody around still remembered the Mathers killing. She looked at him a long moment. "You're Earl's people," she said. It wasn't a question. You got his look around the eyes. "His brother," Raymond said. "He talked about you, not mean. Just said his brother was a judge somewhere and he hoped you were doing right by folks." She wiped the counter that didn't need wiping. Funny thing for him to hope, considering. Raymond didn't ask what she meant. He thought he knew. He found a retired sheriff's deputy named Walt Pruitt, mid-80s now, in a little house with a woodpile out back. Walt had been a young man on the Mathers case. Raymond sat at his table and laid out what he'd found, and Walt listened without saying anything for a long time, the way old men do when you hand them a thing they've been carrying. "We wanted it closed," Walt said finally. "That's the truth of it. She was a good woman and the town was scared, and the sheriff wanted it closed before the election. Greer fit. We made him fit." He looked at his own hands. "I always wondered. I never did a thing about it. Your brother came to see me once, must have been 77. I ran him off my porch, told him to mind his business." He was quiet. "I've thought about that more than once." "Would you sign a statement now?" Raymond asked. "What you just told me, about the truck, about making him fit." Walt Pruitt looked at him. "Will it do any good? Man's been dead 40 years. "It'll put his name on a stone," Raymond said. The old deputy nodded slowly. "Then get me a pen." He found June Holloway's daughter, too, before it was over. The mother was long dead, as Raymond had known she'd be. But the daughter was alive, a woman in her 60s named Cheryl, living in a trailer outside Marion with a yard full of rose bushes. Raymond drove there not knowing what he'd say. He told her who he was and what her mother had signed 40 years before, and he watched the woman's face go through several weathers. "She talked about it at the end," Cheryl said. "When she was dying. She kept saying she'd told a man the truth. We thought she was confused. We thought she meant a preacher." She wiped her hands on her apron, though there was nothing on them. "She meant your brother. All this time we thought it was the morphine talking, and she was telling us the one true thing she had left." "It mattered," Raymond said. "What she signed. It's going to clear a man. I wanted you to know that. Your mother got scared once, a long time ago, and then she got brave. The brave part is the part that's going to last." Cheryl Holloway cried at her own kitchen table, and Raymond sat with her and didn't try to fix it, because Earl's notebooks had taught him that much, that sometimes you just let a person look at the tree line for an hour, and you don't say anything. It took Raymond 4 months. He was a retired judge with money and a name and every connection a long career builds, and it still took 4 months. And that every step he thought about Earl trying to do it alone, with nothing but stubbornness and a grade school education. He hired a lawyer who did innocence work, a sharp young woman named Priya Anand, who took one look at June Holloway's notarized statement and said, "Where has this been?" "In a fire safe," Raymond said, "for 40 years. A man was guarding it." He filed a petition for posthumous exoneration in the same circuit where, as a young prosecutor, he'd helped convict Thomas Greer. He did not hide his own part in it. He could have. Priya told him he could leave his name out of the original prosecution, that it was old enough no one would dig. He told her no. He stood up in a courtroom in front of a judge 30 years younger than himself, a judge who had clerked for him once, and he said out loud on the record that in 1978 he had helped convict an innocent man, and that he had spent the decades since not looking back, and that his brother, who everyone called a failure, had spent those same decades looking at nothing else. The courtroom was very quiet when he sat down. The younger judge, the one who had clerked for him, did not rule from the bench that day. He took it under advisement, which Raymond had expected, and afterward he found Raymond in the hallway. They stood by a window with the afternoon light coming in. "You didn't have to put your own name in it," the young judge said. "You handed me a reason to recuse you out of the record entirely. You know that. You wrote half the rules I'd have used." "I know it." "Then why?" Raymond looked out the window a while. "Because for 40 years the easiest thing was always the thing I picked. And easy is how an innocent man ends up under an oak tree with no name. I'm done picking easy. If clearing him means I have to stand up and say what I was, then that's the price. And it's cheap next to what it cost him." He turned. "My brother paid full freight his whole life and never once tried to get the bill reduced. I figure I can manage it the one time. The young judge nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else. But when the ruling came, it was thorough, and it was unsparing. And it named the failures of the original prosecution plainly, and it did not spare the second chair. Raymond read his own younger self described in cold, legal language as part of a process that had failed a man, and he did not flinch from it. He'd asked for the truth. The truth, when it finally comes, does not soften itself for the people who delayed it. The petition was granted in the spring. June Holloway's recantation, the deputy's statement, the holes in the original case laid bare by 40 years, and one stubborn farmer's box of paper. The court vacated the conviction of Thomas Greer and entered a finding of actual innocence. The county newspaper ran it on the front page, 1,100 words, under a headline that read, "40 years late, a man is cleared, and it was his friend, not the courts, who never quit." The reporter found the rest of it. The farm, the grave, the brother who was a judge. People drove out to Pell's Hollow who had no business there just to see the place. Mavis at the diner said she'd never sold so much pie. But there was a part the newspaper got wrong, and Raymond let them, because some things aren't for the front page. The paper said the judge had cleared the man's name. Raymond knew better. He'd only carried the last few feet of a road his brother had walked for 40 years. All Raymond had done was know which door. He had the stone recut himself. He didn't trust it to anyone else. He drove to the monument company 2 towns over, and he stood over the man's shoulder while it was done, and he paid for it out of his own pocket, not Earl's trust fund, because it mattered to him that this part came from him. They set the new stone on a morning in late May, the kind of morning where the light comes in low and gold across the pasture, and the new grass is so green it looks painted. Raymond stood under the oak with Priya, and old Walt Pruitt leaning on his cane, and Mavis from the diner, and Dale, the lawyer, and a handful of people from town who'd read the story and felt something and come. Not many, enough. The stone read, Thomas Greer, 1952 to 1979, innocent. A good man, known by one friend, cleared at last. And below that smaller, where Raymond had asked them to put it, remembered by Earl Coyle, who never stopped. There was no name on Earl's own grave that day. Earl was buried in the town cemetery, a plain marker because that was what the will had asked for. But Raymond had a second stone cut, a small one, and he set it beside Thomas Greer's, inside the iron fence Earl had painted, so the two of them would be together under the oak. It read only, Earl Coyle. He listened when no one else would, and he was right. Standing there, Raymond thought about the photograph above the wood stove. 2 barefoot boys squinting into the sun. He'd taken it down off the wall and brought it with him, and he set it now against the base of the stone, the careful brother and the wild one. Both of them young, both of them whole, before the wall got built between them, one brick at a time. I was the one who left, Raymond said out loud to no one, to Earl. I told myself it was you, it was me. I left the day I decided I was better than this place. Than you. His voice was rough, he didn't fix it. You were doing the only thing that ever mattered, and I called you a failure to anyone who'd listen. And you hoped I was doing right by folks. He had to stop. I wasn't. Not when it counted. But I am now. 4 months instead of 40 years. That's the only thing I had over you, and I'm sorry it took me this long to spend it. The wind moved in the oak. Somewhere out past the pasture, a meadowlark started up. Walt Pruitt took off his hat and held it against his chest, and after a moment, the rest of them did the same. Raymond did not sell the farm. He moved out to Pell's Hollow that summer. He fixed the fence, the whole length of it, doing it the slow way with his own hands, which had held a gavel for 38 years and had never once mended a thing. He learned to split oak for the wood stove. He was bad at it, and then he was less bad. He sat on the porch in the mornings where Thomas Greer had sat, looking at the tree line, learning what far away looks like. The town changed around him slow, the way towns do. At first, the people of Pell's Hollow watched the retired judge the way you watch a stranger who's bought the place next door, polite and careful. Then the story got around, the whole of it. The brother and the grave and the man cleared 40 years late, and something shifted. Mavis at the diner started keeping his coffee cup behind the counter the way she did for regulars. Walt Pruitt took to coming by on Sundays, and the 2 old men would sit on the porch where Thomas Greer used to sit and not say much, which is the way men that age say the most. Once Walt brought a jar of his late wife's preserves, set it on the rail, and didn't mention it, and Raymond understood that this was an apology and a thank you and a kind of grace all folded into one jar, and he didn't mention it either. A man from down the road, a farmer named Bristow, whose own father had sat on the Greer jury, came up the drive one evening with his hat in his hands. He didn't have a speech, he just said his daddy had carried that verdict to his grave and never could talk about it, and that he, Bristow, was glad it had finally come right. And could he do anything? Fix anything? The fence, maybe? Raymond said the fence was already done, but he'd take the help with the wood, and the two of them split oak until dark, and the man went home lighter than he'd come. Priya Anand kept in touch. She had a stack of cases, she told him, men and women still inside, still waiting, names that needed clearing while there was still someone alive to know it. She asked if he'd consult off the books. Just his judgment, just his read on which doors might open. An old judge who'd spent his whole career being careful now spent it being useful. He took the cases home in cardboard boxes and read them at his brother's kitchen table by the light of the wood stove. And when one of them broke loose, when a name got cleared, he'd drive out past the east pasture and tell the two of them under the oak. The county newspaper did one more story, a year later. By then, 4 men had been let out or cleared with the quiet help of a retired judge in Pell's Hollow who wouldn't take a fee and wouldn't be photographed. The reporter asked him why. Raymond thought about it a long time before he answered. My brother kept a grave ready for 40 years for the day the truth caught up, he said. I figure the least I can do is make the truth a little faster for the next one. He waited too long once. I won't be slow on this. He paused. Those were his words. I'm just borrowing them. The reporter asked him if he had any regrets. One, Raymond said. I had a brother who was better than me my whole life, and I didn't find it out until he was in the ground. Don't let that happen to you. Whoever it is in your family that everybody's decided is the disappointment, go look closer. You might have it exactly backwards. I did, for 40 years. He died 4 years later, on the farm, in the recliner, with the quilt over his knees and a case file open on his lap. Priya found him. The file was a man named Hollis, up in the state penitentiary, and the note Raymond had written in the margin in a judge's careful hand said only, he didn't do it. Look at the timeline. Keep going. She kept going. Hollis walked out the following spring. They buried Raymond under the oak, beside Earl and beside Thomas Greer, inside the iron fence. 3 stones now, where there had once been one with no name. Priya saw to the marker herself. She thought about it a long time, what to put on a man like that, and in the end, she kept it simple, the way the place was simple. Raymond Coyle, judge, brother. He learned, late, what his brother knew all along. The farm went to the work. Raymond had left it that way, deeded to a small foundation Priya ran, a quiet office that did one thing and did it stubbornly. It listened to the people no one else would listen to. The walnut trees still line the drive. The wood stove still works. On the wall above it hangs a photograph of 2 barefoot boys squinting into the sun. And most people who come through never ask who they are, and that's all right. Out past the east pasture, under the oak, the grass is kept green and the iron fence is kept painted, and there are no unnamed stones there anymore. There never will be again. Some debts take 40 years to come due. Some get paid 4 days too late, and some get paid in full by the man who comes after. Earl Coyle waited his whole life to put a name on a stone. His brother put 3. And the truth, which is patient, which can wait under an oak tree longer than any of us can stand to make it wait, finally got to come up into the light and stay there. If you've stayed with Raymond and Earl all the way to the end, thank you. I hope somewhere in it you thought of someone in your own life that the world wrote off too easy. Maybe it's not too late to go look closer. Maybe it is. Either way, don't be 4 days slow. Don't be 40 years. We'll see you under the next oak tree in the next story.